They found Robert Red Cloud and his 8-year-old son Timothy chained to iron stakes at the very edge of Devil's Canyon, left to die under the merciless Arizona sun by men who called them savages, until a heavily pregnant Irish widow named Margaret Flynn stumbled upon them while fleeing her own demons. And what happened next would forge a bond stronger than the chains that bound them.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The desert wind carried no mercy that morning as it swept across the jagged landscape of Devil's Canyon, whipping sand against the weathered faces of cliffs that had witnessed 1,000 years of suffering. Margaret Flynn pressed her swollen belly against the saddle horn, her horse's hooves picking their way carefully along the treacherous rim trail that miners had carved into the rock face decades ago. She had been riding for 3 days straight, running from a past that refused to stay buried, when she heard it, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the cry of a hawk circling overhead, but carried within it something unmistakably human. The sound came again, weaker this time, carried on the hot wind that made the air shimmer like water above the rocks. Maggie pulled her mare to a halt, the leather reins slick with sweat in her calloused hands, squinting against the brutal morning sun that had already begun its daily assault on everything foolish enough to venture into this godforsaken stretch of Arizona territory. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle strapped to her saddle, a habit born from months of traveling alone through country where a woman's life held about as much value as a handful of desert sand, where Apache raiders and white outlaws alike preyed on the vulnerable. What she saw when she peered over the canyon's edge made her stomach lurch with more than just the familiar nausea of her pregnancy. 20 feet down on a narrow ledge that jutted out from the cliff face like a stone finger pointing into the abyss, 2 figures lay motionless in the dirt and scrub brush. A man and a boy, both with the dark hair and bronze skin that marked them as Sioux, both bound with heavy iron chains to stakes driven deep into the rock with the kind of brutal efficiency that spoke of military experience. The man's face was turned skyward, his eyes covered by a strip of cloth that had once been white but now bore the stains of blood and dust. Even from her distance, Maggie could see the way his chest barely rose and fell, each breath a monumental effort that seemed to cost him more strength than he could afford. The boy beside him couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his small body curled protectively against his father's side, despite the chains that held them both prisoner. His dark hair matted with sweat and grime, Maggie's first instinct was to ride away, to pretend she had seen nothing and continue her desperate flight toward whatever sanctuary she might find in the vast emptiness of the territories. She had her own troubles to worry about, her own survival to consider. The baby in her belly was due within the month, and she was already farther from civilization than any woman in her condition had any business being. Getting involved with whatever brutal circumstances had led to this scene would only invite more danger into a life that already held far too much of it. But as she watched, the boy stirred slightly, his dark eyes opening to fix on her with a gaze that seemed far too old for his young face. Those eyes held no pleading, no desperate hope for rescue, only a quiet acceptance that made Maggie's heart constrict in her chest like a fist closing around broken glass. This child had already learned that the world was a place where help rarely came, where survival meant expecting nothing from strangers, where pain was something to be endured in silence until death finally offered its cold mercy. The sight of that resignation in such a young face shattered something inside her that had been barely holding together since she fled Boston 6 months ago. Maggie had lost her own boy just before Christmas, watched helpless as scarlet fever took him despite all her prayers and remedies and the desperate bargains she tried to make with a God who seemed to have turned his face away from her family. She had buried little Patrick Flynn in the cold Irish hills outside Boston before fleeing west with nothing but grief and the life growing in her womb. carrying the weight of a dozen different kinds of failure. The memory of Patrick's last labored breaths, so similar to what she was witnessing now, made the decision for her. She couldn't save her own son, couldn't protect him from the disease that ravaged the Irish neighborhoods, while the wealthy districts remained untouched. But maybe she could save this one. Maybe this time, she could be the help that never came. When she needed it most, without allowing herself time to reconsider or catalog all the ways this decision could go wrong, Maggie dismounted and began searching through her pack for anything that might serve as rope. Her late husband's leather reins would have to do. Sean Flynn had always said they were strong enough to hold any horse God ever made, and she prayed they would be strong enough to hold human lives as well. She tied one end around a sturdy juniper tree that had somehow found purchase in the rocky soil, testing the knot 3 times before she trusted it with her weight. The climb down was harder than she had anticipated, made treacherous by loose rocks and her own ungainly condition. Her pregnancy made her movements clumsy and uncertain. Her center of gravity shifted in ways that made every handhold a gamble. More than once, loose stones skittered away beneath her feet to disappear into the canyon's depths with a sound like rattling bones, and she had to fight down the panic that rose in her throat each time the rope stretched under her weight. The chains holding the prisoners had been secured with military precision. Whoever had done this knew their business, and had meant for these two to die slowly, to suffer every minute of their final hours under the merciless sun. The iron stakes had been driven deep into cracks in the rock face, probably with a sledgehammer, and the shackles themselves were the heavy kind used in federal prisons. This wasn't the work of random outlaws or drunken cowboys. This was systematic, deliberate cruelty carried out by men who believed they were doing righteous work. Up close, the situation was even worse than she had feared. The man's breathing was so shallow it was almost imperceptible, his lips cracked and swollen from dehydration, his skin bearing the waxy pallor that spoke of a body pushed far beyond its limits. Burns and welts covered his arms where the iron shackles had rubbed raw against his skin during what must have been hours or even days of struggle. The blindfold that covered his eyes was soaked with blood from a head wound that looked recent, probably inflicted when they first chained him here. But it was the boy who broke her heart completely. Timothy, though she didn't yet know his name, had positioned his small body to provide what little shade he could for his father, sacrificing his own comfort in a gesture of love that brought tears to Maggie's eyes. His lips moved in what might have been prayer, or simply the delirium that came with severe dehydration, and she could see where he had tried to work his small hands free from the shackles until his wrists were bloody and raw. The locks on the chains were beyond her ability to pick, heavy military hardware that would have challenged even her father's considerable skills. But Maggie had spent enough time around Seamus Flynn's forge to know that iron, no matter how strong, had weak points where it could be persuaded to fail. She pulled a hammer from her pack, a small thing, barely more than a tack hammer, but it would have to serve, and began working at the pins that held the shackles closed, each blow echoing off the canyon walls like gunshots that might draw unwanted attention. The boy's eyes fluttered open at the sound, focusing on her with difficulty through the haze of pain and dehydration. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, cracked and dry as autumn leaves. "Water," he managed, and Maggie immediately pressed her canteen to his lips, watching as he drank greedily before turning his head toward his father, with an urgency that spoke of love deeper than his own desperate thirst. "Easy now," she murmured, supporting the child as he tried to sit up despite the chains that still held him. "I'm going to get you both out of here, but you need to stay still while I work on these chains. Can you tell me your name, sweetheart?" The boy nodded weakly, but she could see the way his eyes kept darting to his father's still form, the fear. "They're as sharp as any blade and far too mature for a child his age. Timothy," he whispered finally, then added with heartbreaking formality, "Timothy Red Cloud, this is my father, Robert. He can't see, they took his sight in the war, but he's the bravest man who ever lived.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The words came out in a rush, as if the boy feared he might not get another chance to speak them. And Maggie felt her heart break a little more at the fierce pride mixed with terror in his young voice. It took nearly an hour of patient work before the first shackle finally gave way with a screech of protesting metal. The boy's wrist was rubbed raw and bleeding where the iron had bitten deep, but he was free. Maggie immediately began working on his father's bonds while Timothy tried to rouse the older man, calling his name in Lakota words that sounded like prayers or songs of mourning. Robert Red Cloud was in far worse shape than his son, his body bearing the marks of a severe beating in addition to the effects of exposure and dehydration. Someone had worked him over with fists and maybe boots before chaining him here, and there were burns on his arms that looked deliberate, inflicted with the kind of careful cruelty that spoke of interrogation rather than simple violence. When Maggie finally managed to free his second arm, he collapsed completely, his breathing becoming so labored that she feared he might not survive the climb back up the cliff face. "Papa!" Timothy cried, his small hands patting his father's face desperately. "Papa, wake up! The lady is helping us." But Robert Red Cloud remained unconscious, lost in whatever dark place pain and trauma had taken him. Maggie checked his pulse, weak but steady, and made the grim calculation of what it would take to get him to safety. The ascent was a nightmare that would haunt Maggie's dreams for years to come. She had to make 3 trips first carrying Timothy, who was light enough for her to manage despite her pregnancy and the treacherous handholds, then returning for the supplies she would need to construct a makeshift stretcher for his father. The boy sat beside the juniper tree, wrapped in her spare blanket, watching with eyes that had seen too much as she prepared for the most difficult rescue of all. Robert Red Cloud was dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive as she struggled to secure him to the crude stretcher she had fashioned from branches and rope. Getting him up the cliff face required every ounce of strength she possessed, and several techniques her father had taught her about leverage and pulleys. By the time she had hauled him to safety, her hands were bleeding, her back screamed in agony, and she could feel the baby moving restlessly in her womb, as if protesting the day's violent activities. But they were alive. All 3 of them were alive, breathing the thin desert air under a sun that had moved past its zenith and begun its slow slide toward evening. Timothy immediately went to his father's side, taking one of the man's scarred hands in both of his small ones and speaking to him in rapid Lakota, as if his voice alone might be enough to call his father back from whatever dark place he had retreated to. Maggie allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to rest, sitting heavily beside her horse and trying to process what she had just done. She had risked her life and the life of her unborn child for 2 strangers, people whose very presence would make her a target in a territory where tensions between whites and Indians ran higher than summer heat. But looking at Timothy's fierce devotion to his unconscious father, she knew she would make the same choice again. Timothy had revived somewhat with water and the small amount of jerky she had shared with him, but his father remained unconscious and burning with fever. The boy's story came out in fragments as they waited, how soldiers had come to their camp claiming to look for stolen horses, how they had accused his father of hiding weapons, how they had beaten him and demanded answers he couldn't give because he had done nothing wrong. The blindfold, Timothy explained with heartbreaking matter-of-factness, was because his father had lost his sight to shrapnel during his service as a scout for the cavalry, back when he still believed cooperation might earn his people fair treatment. They said he was lying about being blind, Timothy whispered, his young voice carrying a weight that no child should ever have to bear. They said all Indians were liars and thieves, and they were going to make an example of us. They said they were going to leave us here until we told the truth about things we never did. The casual cruelty of it chaining a blind man and his child to die of exposure over crimes they hadn't committed made Maggie's blood boiled with a fury that surprised her with its intensity. She had experienced prejudice herself, had seen the signs in Boston shop windows that read, "No Irish need apply," had felt the sting of being considered less than human because of her accent and her heritage. But this was something else entirely. A level of systematic dehumanization that made her stomach turn. Maggie made the decision to load them both onto her horse and head for the nearest settlement, a small trading post called Broken Arrow that lay 2 days' ride to the northeast. It wasn't much, just a collection of adobe buildings, clustered around a well and a corral, but the proprietor was a half-Mexican man named Diego Santos, who had a reputation for dealing fairly with all comers, regardless of their race or circumstances. It was their best hope, possibly their only hope, as they prepared to leave that cursed place. Timothy spoke for the first time about what had happened after the soldiers left them to die. "I tried to keep Papa awake," he said quietly, helping Maggie secure his father to her horse with strips of cloth torn from her spare dress. "I told him stories about grandmother, about the old days when our people lived free on the plains. I sang the songs he taught me, the ones his grandfather sang to him. But he got so quiet, and I thought—" His voice broke, and he couldn't finish the sentence. Maggie knelt beside the boy, her heart breaking at the pain she saw in his dark eyes. She had heard similar words before, directed at her own kind back in Boston, where the Irish were considered little better than vermin by many of the Yankee establishment. Hatred, she had learned, was a poison that infected men's souls and made them capable of unspeakable cruelty, turning neighbors into enemies and children into targets. "Listen to me, Timothy," she said firmly, taking his small hands in hers, and feeling the calluses there that spoke of hard work and responsibility far beyond his years. "Those men were wrong. You and your father are human beings, same as anyone else, and you deserve to live with dignity and respect. Don't you ever let anyone tell you different. Your father fought for this country, served it with honor, and no one has the right to treat him like an animal." The boy nodded solemnly, but she could see that the words of his tormentors had cut deep, carving wounds that would take far longer to heal than the physical injuries he bore. It would take more than a stranger's kindness to restore a child's faith in the goodness of humanity, to convince him that not all white people were enemies, that mercy and justice still existed somewhere in a world that seemed determined to prove otherwise. As they began their slow journey toward Broken Arrow, Maggie found herself thinking about the chain of circumstances that had brought them together. If she hadn't been fleeing Boston, if she hadn't chosen this particular trail, if she hadn't heard Timothy's weak cry for help, any one of those factors changed, and father and son would have died alone under the desert sun. Just 2 more casualties in a conflict that seemed to have no end and precious little honor on either side. The trail ahead stretched out before them like a promise and a threat, winding through landscape that could be breathtakingly beautiful one moment and utterly deadly the next. Behind them lay the canyon where 2 innocent people had been left to die simply because of the color of their skin and the culture they came from. But between those 2 points, the past and the future, rode a pregnant Irish widow and 2 Sioux survivors, bound together by circumstance and the unshakable belief that mercy was still possible in a world that seemed determined to forget its meaning. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Maggie of the stained glass windows in the church where she had married Sean Flynn, she urged her horse forward along the dusty trail. She didn't know what awaited them at Broken Arrow, didn't know if they would find help or more hostility, medicine, or bullets. All she knew was that 3 lives had intersected at the edge of a canyon, and whatever happened next, they would face it together. The desert wind continued to blow, carrying with it the scent of sage and creosote, the promise of storm clouds gathering on the distant horizon, and something else, something that might have been hope or might have been foolishness, but felt real enough to carry them through the long miles ahead. For the first time in months, Since before Patrick's death, and Sean's drinking, and the long spiral that had brought her to this desolate place, Maggie felt something she had almost forgotten existed: purpose. Behind them, Devil's Canyon stretched, its mouth wide in a permanent scream, bearing witness to what men were capable of when they forgot that their enemies were human too. But ahead lay possibility, fragile and uncertain as desert flowers after rain, but real enough to build a future on. And sometimes, in a world as harsh and unforgiving as the Arizona Territory, possibility was all you needed to take the first step toward salvation. The first night on the trail tested every ounce of resolve Maggie Flynn possessed. Robert Red Cloud's fever had worsened as the sun disappeared behind the jagged mountains, his body shaking with chills despite the lingering desert heat that still radiated from the rocks around their makeshift camp. Timothy sat beside his father, like a guardian angel, bathing the older man's forehead with precious water from Maggie's rapidly diminishing supply, while whispering prayers in Lakota that sounded like ancient songs carried on the wind. Maggie had chosen their campsite carefully, a shallow depression between two boulder formations that would hide their fire from anyone watching the main trail, with enough scrub brush to provide cover for the horses and a clear view of the approaches from 3 directions. Her husband Sean had taught her these things during their brief marriage, skills learned from his own father who had fought in the Mexican War, and understood that survival often depended on thinking like prey rather than predator. "He's getting worse," Timothy said quietly, his young voice carrying the kind of calm that came from having already faced the worst thing he could imagine. The boy had cleaned his father's wounds with strips torn from Maggie's petticoat, displaying a competence that spoke of previous experience with injury and crisis. His breathing changed after the sun went down. Grandmother always said that was when the spirits came closest, when they decided whether to take you or let you stay. Maggie knelt beside the unconscious man, pressing her ear to his chest to listen to the rhythm of his heart. It was irregular, skipping beats in a way that made her own pulse quicken with worry. She had seen this before, back in Boston during the fever outbreaks that swept through the Irish neighborhoods like wildfire. Bodies pushed beyond their limits, sometimes simply gave up, no matter how strong the will to live might be. "We need to get his fever down," she said, more to herself than to Timothy. "There's willow bark in my pack. My mother taught me how to make tea from it for fever and pain. And we'll need to keep him drinking water, even if we have to pour it down his throat drop by drop." She looked at the boy seriously. "Can you help me with that? It's going to be a long night." Timothy nodded with the solemnity of a much older person. "Papa taught me about healing plants too. The white man's medicine and the old ways," he said. "Knowledge was like water. It didn't matter what kind of cup you used to drink it as long as you were thirsty enough to learn." The boy's eyes reflected the flickering firelight as he continued. He learned about herbs from the cavalry surgeon when he was scouting for the army, before they decided his skin was the wrong color for trust. As Maggie prepared the willow bark tea, Timothy told her more of their story. Robert Red Cloud had been born on the Pine Ridge Reservation, but had left as a young man to serve with the U.S. Cavalry as a scout, believing that proving his loyalty might earn better treatment for his people. He had married a schoolteacher named Sarah Whitehorse, a woman who spoke 4 languages and had dreamed of building a school where Indian and white children could learn together. "Mama died when I was 5, Timothy said matter-of-factly, stirring the coals of their small fire with a stick. Cholera came through the reservation that year, and she caught it helping to care for the sick. Papa said she died the way she lived, thinking about other people more than herself. After that, it was just him and me, traveling from place to place while he looked for work that would let him use his skills instead of just his strong back." The tea was bitter and harsh, but they managed to get several spoonfuls down Robert's throat over the course of the night. Maggie took turns with Timothy, one of them always awake to monitor his breathing while the other dozed fitfully by the dying fire. The desert night was full of sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through stone formations that had stood since before humans walked this land, sometime around midnight. Robert began to speak in his delirium, words in Lakota mixed with English fragments that painted a picture of his service in the cavalry. He spoke of battles fought alongside men who called him friend by day and savage by night, of promises made by officers who meant well but lacked the power to keep them, of watching his people's way of life disappear piece by piece while he wore the blue uniform he had once been proud of. He still has nightmares about the war, Timothy explained softly when his father's mumblings became particularly agitated. Not about the fighting, Papa wasn't afraid of that. About the things he saw white soldiers do to Indian women and children, and the things Indian warriors did to white families. He said the real war wasn't between the cavalry and the tribes, it was between the part of him that wanted to believe in justice and the part that knew better. By dawn, Robert's fever had broken, leaving him weak but conscious for the first time since Maggie had found them at the canyon. His sightless eyes turned toward the sound of her voice when she spoke, and she could see the intelligence there, the awareness that cut through his physical pain like a blade through fog. When he tried to sit up, Timothy was immediately at his side, supporting him with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. "You're the woman who freed us," Robert said, his voice hoarse but steady. It wasn't a question somehow. Despite his blindness and delirium, he had understood what happened. "Timothy told me while I was floating in the dark. He said you climbed down into hell itself to break our chains." His weathered face turned toward her with uncanny accuracy, as if he could sense her location through some faculty beyond normal sight. Anyone would have done the same, Maggie replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. Plenty of people had surely passed within miles of Devil's Canyon over the years, and most had minded their own business rather than risk involvement in someone else's troubles. "How are you feeling? Do you think you can travel today?" Robert nodded slowly, testing his strength by moving his arms and legs. The shackle wounds were still raw and painful, but he seemed determined not to let weakness slow their progress. "Those soldiers will come looking for us eventually," he said quietly, so Timothy couldn't hear. "They can't afford to let us live to tell what they did. We need to reach somewhere safe before they realize we're gone." The second day of travel was harder than the first, not because of Robert's condition, which continued to improve as the hours passed, but because of the country they had to cross. The trail to Broken Arrow led through a series of narrow valleys and exposed ridges where a traveler could be seen for miles, terrain that favored hunters more than prey. Maggie found herself constantly scanning the horizon for dust clouds that might indicate pursuit, while Timothy rode behind his father with eyes that missed nothing despite his young age. They were making good time across a flat stretch of alkali desert when Timothy suddenly stiffened and pointed toward their back trail. "Riders," he said simply, his voice carrying no panic but plenty of concern. "3 of them, maybe 4. Still far back, but they're moving fast." Maggie shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun and saw the distant dust plume that had caught the boy's attention. "How far to Broken Arrow?" Robert asked, his head tilted to listen for sounds that his heightened hearing might catch before theirs. Despite his blindness, or perhaps because of it, he seemed to have an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, noting changes in air pressure and wind direction that escaped normal observation. 6 hours if we push hard, Maggie replied, calculating distances in her head while her heart began to race with the familiar rush of fear and adrenaline. "But we'll have to cross open ground for most of it, nowhere to hide if they get close enough to spot us." She looked at Robert's pale face, knowing he wasn't strong enough for the kind of desperate flight that might be required. Instead of running, Robert made a decision that surprised them both. "There's a place about 2 miles ahead, Massacre Creek, they call it now, though it had a prettier name once. The creek runs through a canyon with walls too steep for horses. If we can reach it before they catch sight of us, we can follow the water downstream and come out near Broken Arrow without using the main trail. The detour added miles to their journey, but it might save their lives. They pushed their horses as hard as they dared across the exposed ground, with Timothy constantly checking their back trail for signs that the pursuing riders had spotted them. The sun seemed to crawl across the sky with deliberate slowness, each minute stretching into an eternity of tension and uncertainty. Massacre Creek turned out to be aptly named a narrow slash in the earth where Apache warriors had once ambushed a cavalry patrol, leaving bones to bleach in the sun for decades afterward. The canyon walls rose 50 feet on either side, creating a corridor of shadow and echoing water sounds that felt like a sanctuary after the exposed desert. Their horses picked their way carefully along the rocky creek bed, splashing through pools that reflected the narrow strip of sky visible above. "This is where my grandfather died," Robert said quietly as they navigated a particularly treacherous section where the creek curved around a massive boulder. He was with that cavalry patrol, serving as a scout, when Red Horse's warriors caught them in the Narrows. Grandmother always said he chose the wrong side in that fight, but I think he just chose the side he thought might let his children live in peace. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, a Sioux scout's grandson, blinded in service to the same army that had now tried to murder him, seeking refuge in the place where his ancestor had died fighting for an impossible dream of coexistence. Timothy seemed to understand the weight of the moment, reaching out to touch his father's hand in a gesture of comfort that spoke volumes about the bond between them. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they emerged from Massacre Creek to find themselves within sight of Broken Arrow's adobe buildings and corrals. The trading post looked exactly as Maggie remembered it from her previous travels, a collection of low structures clustered around a central courtyard, with smoke rising from multiple chimneys and the sound of human voices carrying on the desert air. It looked like civilization, like safety, like the answer to prayers she hadn't dared voice, but their arrival at Broken Arrow was not the refuge they had hoped for. Diego Santos, the proprietor, met them at the gate with a face full of worry and hands that trembled slightly as he helped Robert down from Maggie's horse. The half-Mexican trader had always been fair in his dealings, treating all customers with equal respect regardless of their race or circumstances. But something had changed in the week since Maggie's last visit. "Senora Flynn," Santos said quietly, glancing nervously at the horizon behind them. "You bring trouble to my door, I think. There are soldiers asking questions, offering money for information about a blind Indian and his boy. They say he is a dangerous criminal, a murderer who escaped from custody." His weathered face showed the strain of a man caught between competing loyalties. "He's no criminal," Maggie said firmly, helping Timothy down from the horse while keeping one eye on Robert, who was swaying slightly with exhaustion despite his efforts to appear strong. "He's a decorated cavalry scout who was tortured and left to die for crimes he never committed. Those soldiers are the real criminals here." Santos studied Robert's face for a long moment, taking in the obvious signs of recent trauma, the healing head wound, the shackle marks on his wrists, the hollow-eyed look of a man who had stared death in the face and somehow lived to tell about it. "I have heard stories about such things," the trader said finally, "about soldiers who think the law doesn't apply when dealing with Indians. But helping you could mean trouble for everyone here." The sound of approaching hooves cut through their conversation like a knife. 3 riders were coming hard up the main trail, close enough now that individual faces could be distinguished beneath their cavalry hats. Santos cursed softly in Spanish, then made a decision that would define the kind of man he truly was. "Quickly," he said, gesturing toward a small building behind the main store. There was a root cellar beneath the floor. It was built to hide from Apache raids, but it will serve for this as well. They had barely gotten Robert and Timothy hidden when the soldiers rode into the trading post's courtyard, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces set in the hard lines of men, accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. The leader, a sergeant with corporal stripes and eyes like chips of flint, dismounted and approached Santos with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no by a Mexican shopkeeper. "We're looking for fugitives," the sergeant announced without preamble. "A blind Indian and his boy, traveling with a white woman. They're wanted for questioning in connection with stolen army supplies and the murder of 2 soldiers." He produced a piece of paper that might have been an official warrant or might have been something he had written himself that morning. Santos examined the document with the careful attention of a man who could read English better than his accent might suggest. "This is very serious," he said slowly, buying time while his mind worked through the implications. "When did these terrible crimes occur? I keep careful records of all visitors to my establishment." Meanwhile, hidden in the root cellar beneath their feet, Maggie pressed her hand over Timothy's mouth to keep him quiet while Robert lay motionless beside them, his breathing so controlled it seemed he might have stopped altogether. The cellar was cramped and airless, filled with the earthy smell of stored potatoes and onions. But it was the difference between life and death in a situation where the wrong word could mean a noose or a bullet. The interrogation above them continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The sergeant's voice grew increasingly frustrated as Santos maintained his pose of helpful cooperation while actually revealing nothing of value. "You're sure you haven't seen them? There might be a reward for information leading to their capture. If I had seen such dangerous criminals, I would certainly have reported it to the proper authorities," Santos replied with just the right mixture of fear and civic duty. "But perhaps you would like to search my buildings? I want to cooperate fully with the law." It was a clever gambit, appearing to offer help while actually challenging them to produce a real warrant for their search. The sergeant hesitated, clearly not expecting this level of cooperation from someone he had probably planned to intimidate into submission. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he folded the questionable warrant and tucked it back into his jacket. "That won't be necessary. Just keep your eyes open and send word if they show up. These are dangerous people, the woman especially. She's wanted for questioning in connection with terrorist activities back east." After the soldiers left, Santos waited a full hour before opening the root cellar and helping his hidden guests back to the surface. The trader's hands were still, shaking slightly, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "They will be back," he said simply. "And next time they may bring more men or a real warrant. You cannot stay here long. Where can we go?" Maggie asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her thoughts since they left Devil's Canyon. "If the army wants us dead, there's nowhere in the territories that will be safe. They'll keep hunting until they find us or until we're too dead to matter." Robert, who had been listening to the conversation with the intense concentration of a man whose survival depended on information rather than sight, suddenly spoke up. "There is a place," he said quietly, "far to the north, across the Colorado River, where the Mormons have their settlements. They don't love the federal government any more than we do right now, and they have their own ways of dealing with problems. A man named Brigham Caldwell runs a station there. He used to buy horses from my people before the trouble started. It was a slim hope, but it was hope nonetheless. The Mormon settlements were notorious for their independence from federal authority, and their conflicts with Washington over polygamy and territorial governance had created a mutual distrust that might work in favor of refugees from army justice. It would mean weeks of dangerous travel through country that was hostile to all of them for different reasons, but it might also mean a chance at real safety. As they prepared to leave Broken Arrow under cover of darkness, Santos pressed supplies into their hands, food, ammunition, and a letter of introduction to contacts along the Northern Trail who might be willing to help. "Go with God," he said simply, embracing each of them in turn. "And remember that there are still good people in this world, even when it seems like all the devils have been set loose." The moon was dark as they rode north from Broken Arrow, following trails that Robert knew from his cavalry days in Timothy. Navigated with the instinctive skill of someone who had learned to read the land as easily as city children read books. Behind them lay the relative safety of civilization. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of desert, mountains, uncertainty. But for the first time since finding them chained at Devil's Canyon, Maggie felt something that might have been optimism. They were no longer just running from death. They were traveling toward the possibility of life. And sometimes, in a world where justice was scarce and mercy even scarcer, possibility was enough to light the way through the darkest night. The Badlands north of Broken Arrow stretched endlessly. Under a star-filled sky that offered no comfort, only the cold reminder of how small and vulnerable they were in the vast emptiness of the Arizona Territory. 3 days into their desperate flight toward the Mormon settlements, Maggie's water supplies were running dangerously low. Her horse was showing signs of exhaustion, and Robert Red Cloud's earlier recovery had given way to a persistent fever that left him swaying in the saddle like a man walking in his sleep. Timothy rode beside his father with the vigilance of a sentry, one small hand always ready to steady the older man should he begin to fall. The boy had grown quieter with each passing mile, his dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit that they all knew would come eventually. The soldiers wouldn't give up easily. Too much was at stake for them to allow witnesses to their crimes to escape into territories where federal authority held less sway. "There," Robert said suddenly, raising one scarred hand to point toward a distant rock formation that looked like a crumbling cathedral against the dawn sky. Despite his blindness, his ability to navigate by sound, wind direction, and some indefinable sense of place had proven uncannily accurate throughout their journey. Preacher's Rock. There should be a spring in the canyon behind it, if the Apache haven't poisoned it since my scouting days. The spring turned out to be little more than a muddy seep in the rocks, but it was water, and after boiling it over a carefully hidden fire, it tasted like salvation to 3 people who had been rationing their supplies drop by precious drop. They filled their canteens and watered the horses while keeping watch for any sign that they had been followed. But the desert remained empty of everything except the endless wind and the circling shadows of vultures overhead. It was while they rested in the shade of Preacher's Rock that Timothy made a discovery that would change everything. Exploring the narrow canyon behind the spring, the boy found something that made him cry out in alarm: fresh horse droppings, boot prints, in the mud and the cold ashes of a recent campfire. Someone else had been here, and recently enough that the signs hadn't been erased by wind or weather. "Apache," Robert said grimly when Timothy described what he had found. The blind man's face had gone pale beneath his weathered skin, and his hands moved instinctively toward the rifle Diego Santos had pressed into his arms at Broken Arrow. "This is their hunting season. They'll be moving through these canyons looking for prey, either animal or human. We need to leave now, before they pick up our trail." But as they prepared to depart, the decision was taken out of their hands. A rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, and a bullet struck the rock face inches from Maggie's head, sending stone chips flying like deadly rain. More shots followed, coming from the rim above them, and suddenly the narrow canyon that had seemed like sanctuary became a trap with walls too steep to climb, and only one way out: down. Robert shouted, his military training taking over despite his blindness. He dragged Timothy behind a boulder while Maggie dove for cover behind their frightened horses, trying to control the animals while bullets whined overhead like angry wasps. The attackers, whoever they were, had chosen their position well, turning the canyon into a shooting gallery where their targets had nowhere to run. Through the chaos of gunfire and ricocheting bullets, Maggie caught sight of their attackers. On the canyon rim above, they weren't Apache warriors, as Robert had feared, but something potentially worse: a mixed group of white outlaws and renegade Indians who had banded together outside the law, preying on travelers foolish enough to venture into the Badlands alone. These men recognized no authority except violence and showed mercy to no one who couldn't defend themselves. The leader of the outlaw band was a scarred giant of a man named Knife Hand Morgan, so called for the blade he wore strapped to his left wrist in place of the hand he had lost years earlier in a knife fight with a Comanche warrior. Morgan's reputation for cruelty was legendary throughout the territories. It was said he had once burned an entire wagon train just to watch the flames, and that he wore a necklace made from the finger bones of his victims. "You in the canyon." Morgan's voice boomed down from the rim above, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed through fear alone. "Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands where we can see them. Do it now, and maybe we'll make your deaths quick instead of taking our time with the entertainment." His laugh was like the sound of grinding glass. Robert's response was to fire 3 rapid shots at the sound of the voice, each bullet placed with the precision of a man who had learned to shoot by sound rather than sight. One of the outlaws screamed and toppled from the rim, crashing into the canyon floor with a sickening thud, while the others scrambled for better cover among the rocks above. "That was a mistake, blind man," Morgan roared, his voice now carrying the edge of genuine anger rather than casual cruelty. "I was going to kill you clean, but now I think we'll take our time. Maybe start with the boy, let you listen to him scream before we get to the woman." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Timothy pressed closer to his father's side. The siege that followed tested every resource they possessed. The outlaws had them pinned down with no escape route, but they also couldn't approach the canyon floor without exposing themselves to Robert's deadly accurate rifle fire. Hour after hour passed in a deadly game of cat and mouse, with bullets flying whenever anyone on either side exposed themselves for even a moment. As the sun climbed higher and the heat in the canyon became oppressive, Maggie began to realize that time was working against them. Their ammunition was limited, their water was nearly gone, and Robert's fever was clearly getting worse despite his efforts to hide his weakness. Meanwhile, the outlaws could afford to wait. They had the high ground, superior numbers, and nothing but time to wear down their prey. It was Timothy who came up with the plan that would save them, displaying a tactical intelligence that would have impressed veteran cavalry officers. While studying the canyon walls during a lull in the fighting, the boy noticed something the adults had missed: a narrow crack in the rock face that might, with careful climbing, allow someone small enough to reach the rim unseen. "I can get up there," Timothy whispered to his father during a quiet moment when the outlaws seemed to be regrouping for another assault. "There's a way up the back wall, too narrow for a grown person, but big enough for me. If I can get behind them with a rifle, maybe I can even the odds a little." The idea of sending an 8-year-old boy into such danger went against every protective instinct Maggie possessed, but she could see from Robert's expression that he understood the desperate logic of the plan. They were going to die anyway if something didn't change the situation, and Timothy was the only one among them with any chance of reaching the high ground undetected. "Listen to me, son," Robert said quietly, gripping the boy's shoulder with one scarred hand. "You don't have to be a hero today. We've lived good lives, you and I, and if this is where our trail ends, then we'll face it together like men. Don't risk yourself for 2 people who are already marked for death." But Timothy had inherited more than his father's tactical intelligence. He had also inherited his stubborn courage and his unwillingness to abandon those he loved. "You came back for me at Devil's Canyon when you could have run," the boy said simply. "Now it's my turn to come back for you." Before either adult could stop him, he had slipped away toward the crack in the canyon wall. The climb that followed was a nightmare of loose rock and desperate handholds, made more treacherous by the need for absolute silence. One falling stone, one scrape of boot against rock, and the outlaws would realize what was happening in turn, their guns on a target too small and quick for them to miss at close range. But Timothy moved with the fluid grace of someone raised in country where a misplaced step could mean death. Meanwhile, in the canyon below, Maggie and Robert kept up a steady but careful rate of fire to mask any sounds the boy's climb might make. Each shot had to count. Their ammunition was too precious to waste on anything but clear targets. But they also had to maintain the impression that they were still fully engaged in the fight from their original position. It took Timothy nearly an hour to reach the rim, emerging from the crack in the rocks like a ghost materialized from stone itself. The outlaws were spread out along the canyon edge, focused entirely on the targets below and completely unaware that death had just appeared behind them in the form of a determined 8-year-old with his father's rifle and his grandmother's prayers. The first shot took Knife Hand Morgan completely by surprise, the bullet catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around with a scream of pain and outrage. The second shot, fired before the echoes of the first had died away, dropped another outlaw before the man could even turn to see where the attack was coming from. Chaos erupted along the canyon rim as the remaining outlaws suddenly found themselves caught between two fires. Some tried to return Timothy's fire while others continued shooting into the canyon, and in the confusion of shouted orders and flying bullets, the boy managed to work his way along the rim to a better position. "Behind you!" one of the outlaws screamed, finally spotting Timothy's muzzle flash among the rocks. "It's just a kid, kill the little bastard." But shooting at a small, fast-moving target who knew the terrain was very different from picking off trapped victims in a canyon, and Timothy had learned well from his father's lessons in survival. The battle turned into a running fight along the canyon rim, with Timothy using every trick Robert had taught him about cover and movement, while the surviving outlaws tried desperately to corner their elusive tormentor. From below, Maggie and Robert could only listen to the gunfire above and hope that their young protector would survive the risks he had taken for their sake. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. For long minutes, nothing moved on the canyon rim except the wind stirring dust devils among the rocks. Then Timothy's voice called down to them, high and clear and alive. "It's over. They're all dead or run off." "But Papa, I need help. One of them got me in the leg before I got him, and I can't climb back down by myself." The relief in Maggie's heart was so intense it made her knees weak, but it was tempered by concern for the boy's injury and the practical problem of how to get him down from the rim. The rescue that followed required all of Robert's knowledge of knots and leverage, combined with Maggie's determination to risk her own life rather than abandon the boy who had just saved them all. Using ropes salvaged from their packs and a complex arrangement of pulleys improvised from rifle slings and saddle leather, they managed to lower Timothy to the canyon floor. The bullet wound in the boy's leg was painful but not life-threatening, a clean graze that had bled freely but missed bone and major blood vessels. As Maggie cleaned and bandaged the injury, Timothy told them about the fight on the rim, speaking with the matter-of-fact tone of someone still processing the reality of what he had just done. "I kept thinking about what you said, Papa, about how sometimes a man has to choose between being safe and being right. Those men up there, they chose wrong a long time ago, and they kept choosing wrong until someone made them stop." The boy's eyes were older now, marked by the kind of experience that changed a person forever. They left Preacher's Rock behind them as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, carrying with them the weapons and supplies salvaged from their defeated enemies. The immediate threat had passed, but they all understood that other dangers lay ahead: the desert itself, the pursuing cavalry, and the uncertainty of what they would find when they finally reached the Mormon settlements. As they rode north, through country that grew more desolate with each passing mile, Robert began to tell them stories of his grandfather's time, when the Lakota had roamed free across the plains, and a man's worth was measured by his courage rather than the color of his skin. They were stories of a world that was dying, maybe already dead, but they carried within them the seeds of something that might yet grow in new soil. "The old people used to say that every ending was also a beginning," Robert said as they made camp that night beside a dry wash that had once been a river. "They said the spirits never really died. They just changed form and waited for the right time to be born again." Maybe that's what we're doing now, dying to who we used to be, so we can become who we're meant to be. Timothy, despite his wound and exhaustion, sat up straighter at his father's words. The boy who had climbed the canyon wall that morning was gone, replaced by someone older and more serious, but somehow stronger as well. "Do you think we'll be safe when we get to the Mormon place?" he asked. "Safe is a word people use when they don't want to think about tomorrow," Robert replied. "What we'll be is alive and free and together. Sometimes that's the best kind of safe there is." He turned his sightless eyes toward the north, where their destination lay hidden beyond miles of desert and mountain. "The rest we'll figure out. When we get there." The desert night closed around them like a blanket woven from starlight and possibility. Behind them lay a trail marked by violence and narrow escapes. Ahead lay uncertainty and the promise of sanctuary that might prove to be illusion. But for three people who had found each other at the edge of a canyon where men had meant them to die, the future was bright enough to travel toward. In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the moon, and somewhere in that wild sound was the echo of all the voices that had called this land home before the coming of borders and boundaries and the terrible certainties that divided people into us and them. Tonight, there was only the desert, the stars, and three human beings who had chosen to believe that somewhere ahead lay a place where they could build something new from the ashes of everything they had lost. The settlement of Zion's Rest appeared like a mirage shimmering in the morning heat, its whitewashed adobe buildings and neat garden plots standing in stark contrast to the raw wilderness that surrounded it on all sides. After 2 weeks of hard travel through country that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to cross it, the sight of cultivated fields and children playing in dusty streets felt like stepping into another world entirely, a place where civilization had taken root despite the hostile environment that surrounded it. Maggie's labor pains had started 3 days earlier, coming in waves that left her gasping and clinging to her horse's mane while Robert and Timothy took turns supporting her in the saddle. The baby wasn't due for another 2 weeks by her calculations, but the hardships of their flight seemed to have convinced the child that the uncertain safety of the womb was no longer preferable to the dangerous freedom of the outside world. Each contraction felt like a fist squeezing her insides, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out in a way that might alert any pursuers to their location. "Hold on just a little longer," Timothy whispered to her as they approached the settlement's gates, his young face creased with worry that made him look far older than his 8 years. The boy had appointed himself her guardian during the final stages of their journey, riding beside her with the protective intensity of someone who had already lost too much to bear losing anyone else. His dark eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, watching for dust clouds that might indicate cavalry pursuit. The Mormon guards at the gate were a study in contradictions, men who carried rifles with the easy competence of soldiers, but whose eyes held the gentle warmth of farmers and fathers. Their leader, a weathered man named Brother Jenkins, stepped forward to greet the travelers with a courtesy that seemed almost formal after weeks of dealing with hostile strangers. When Brigham Caldwell emerged from the settlement's modest church to greet them personally, his weathered face showed none of the suspicion that strangers usually encounter on the frontier. "You'll be the ones Diego Santos wrote about," Caldwell said simply, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions for his community. The woman in need of sanctuary, the blind warrior, and his brave son. His eyes took in their travel-stained clothes, their obvious exhaustion, and Maggie's condition with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent years caring for refugees from various kinds of persecution. Caldwell was a man in his 50s, who carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned leadership through necessity rather than ambition. His hands were calloused from years of manual labor, his face weathered by desert sun and mountain wind, but his voice held the educated cadences of someone who had read deeply and thought carefully about the responsibilities of leading others. Behind him stood other men and women of the settlement, their faces showing curiosity mixed with the wariness that came from living always on the edge of federal disapproval. "We don't want to bring trouble to your people," Robert said carefully, his sightless eyes fixed on the sound of Caldwell's voice. "The federal government considers us fugitives, and soldiers may come looking for us eventually. We'll move on if our presence puts you at risk." His posture remained straight despite his exhaustion, the bearing of a man who had served in uniform and understood the weight of responsibility. Caldwell's laugh was warm and surprisingly hearty, cutting through the tension that had surrounded their arrival like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Brother, the federal government considers us all fugitives out here. We've had our own disagreements with Washington about how free people should be allowed to live their lives. As far as we're concerned, the enemy of our enemy is our friend, especially when that enemy wears a blue uniform and thinks he can tell us what to believe or how to organize our families." Another contraction hit Maggie then, stronger than any before it, a wave of pain that seemed to originate in her spine and radiate through her entire body like fire. She would have fallen from her horse if Timothy hadn't been there to catch her, his small hand surprisingly strong as he helped support her weight. Caldwell immediately took charge of the situation with the calm efficiency of a man who had delivered many babies in a place where doctors were scarce and midwives had to be practical above all else. "Sarah," he called to a woman who had been watching from the doorway of a nearby house, her graying hair neatly braided, and her apron spotless despite the dust that seemed to coat everything else in the desert. "Bring the birthing supplies to the guest cabin. We have a baby who's decided not to wait for proper introductions." Within minutes, Maggie found herself in a clean bed, surrounded by capable Mormon women who treated her condition as a blessing rather than an inconvenience. The guest cabin was a simple but comfortable structure, with thick adobe walls that kept out the desert heat and wooden floors polished smooth by years of use. Clean white curtains hung at the windows, and the smell of lavender and sage filled the air from bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters. It was the first time in months that Maggie had been in a space designed for comfort rather than mere survival, and the contrast was almost overwhelming. Sarah Caldwell proved to be a woman of remarkable competence and gentle authority, her hands sure and steady as she began preparing for the birth. She had delivered dozens of babies over the years, including several under conditions far more primitive than these, and her calm confidence helped steady Maggie's nerves during the worst of the contractions. "Tell me about the pains," Sarah said quietly, her fingers checking Maggie's pulse and temperature with the practiced touch of someone who understood that childbirth was as much about reading signs as it was about providing physical assistance. "How long have they been coming, and how far apart? Has there been any bleeding, any signs that the baby might be in distress?" The labor was long and difficult, complicated by weeks of poor nutrition and the stress of constant flight. Maggie's body had been pushed to its limits during their escape from Devil's Canyon, and now it struggled to accomplish the enormous task of bringing new life into the world. Sarah sat beside the bed throughout the ordeal, her strong hands providing comfort and encouragement while Maggie fought through waves of pain that seemed to go on forever. "This child has the spirit of a fighter," Sarah said quietly during one of the brief lulls between contractions, her weathered face creased with the kind of smile that came from witnessing many miracles of birth. "She's been through trials already. That would break a grown person, and she's still determined to make her entrance into this world. That kind of strength will serve her well in the years to come, especially if she grows up in country like this." Outside the cabin, Robert and Timothy waited with the peculiar tension of men who understood that some battles could only be fought by women. The Mormon community had welcomed them with a warmth that seemed almost miraculous after months of suspicion and hostility, but both father and son remained alert for any sign that their sanctuary might prove temporary or that their presence might bring danger to their hosts. The settlement around them was a marvel of organization and industry, That spoke to years of careful planning and backbreaking labor. Gardens flourished despite the arid climate, irrigated by an ingenious system of channels and reservoirs that captured every drop of precious rainwater. Workshops and forges produced everything from horseshoes to furniture, while the school building echoed with the voices of children learning to read in both English and the Danish or Swedish of their immigrant parents. "Your woman is strong," Caldwell said, settling onto the porch beside Robert as the afternoon stretched toward evening, his own weathered hands busy with carving a piece of wood into what looked like a toy horse. "But strength alone isn't always enough. She's been carrying more than just that baby. She's been carrying the weight of keeping all of you alive. Sometimes the body decides it's carried enough, and it just gives up the fight." Timothy, who had been whittling a piece of wood with the knife Santos had given him, looked up sharply at the implied concern in the older man's voice. His dark eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "She saved us," he said fiercely, his young voice carrying a conviction that made both men look at him with new respect. "When those soldiers left Papa and me to die, she climbed down into that canyon and broke our chains with her bare hands. She's not going to die now, I won't let her." The fierce loyalty in the boy's voice brought a smile to Caldwell's weathered face, the kind of expression that spoke to a lifetime of watching children grow into their courage under impossible circumstances. "Son, I've seen men half again your age with less heart than you're showing right now. But some things aren't up to us. They're in the hands of Providence. All we can do is provide what help we can and trust that the Lord knows what He's about, even when His plans don't make sense to us." As night fell over Zion's Rest, the sounds from the birthing cabin grew more urgent. Maggie's cries of pain echoed across the settlement's quiet streets, answered by the gentle murmur of women's voices offering encouragement and prayer. It was a sound as old as humanity itself. The eternal struggle between life and death that played out in bedrooms and birthing huts across every culture and continent. A reminder that some experiences transcended the boundaries that divided people. Other women from the settlement had gathered to help Sister Hanson with her knowledge of herbal remedies. Sister Martinez, who had delivered her own children without assistance during the family's migration from Mexico, and young Sister Thompson, who had lost her first baby and understood the particular fears that haunted every difficult birth. They worked together with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to depend on each other for survival. Near midnight, when the desert air had finally cooled enough to provide some relief from the day's heat and the stars blazed overhead with the brilliant intensity that only desert skies could provide, a new sound joined the chorus, the thin, indignant wail of a newborn baby announcing her arrival to a world that had better be ready for her presence. Timothy jumped to his feet so quickly he nearly fell off the porch, while Robert's face showed the first genuine smile anyone had seen since Devil's Canyon. Sarah Caldwell emerged from the cabin a few minutes later, her face exhausted but triumphant, her graying hair disheveled and her apron stained with the honest evidence of hard work successfully completed. "You have a daughter," she announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction that came from helping to bring new life safely into the world. "And before you ask, both mother and baby are doing fine. The little one is small but strong, and she has her mother's red hair and her own considerable opinion about being born into such interesting times." When they were finally allowed into the cabin to meet the newest member of their unusual family, they found Maggie propped up in bed with the baby nestled against her chest, both of them exhausted, but radiating the deep contentment that followed successful childbirth. Despite the ordeal she had just endured, there was a glow about her that spoke of the deep satisfaction that came from successfully bringing new life into the world. Against considerable odds, the baby was indeed small, as Sarah had warned. But her grip was strong when she wrapped tiny fingers around Timothy's offered thumb, and her eyes, when they opened, held the bright alertness of someone who intended to take full measure of this world she had been born into. Her hair was a wispy crown of red gold that caught the lamplight like spun copper. "What will you call her?" Timothy asked softly, reaching out one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand with the reverent care of someone who understood that he was witnessing something sacred. The child immediately grasped his finger with the instinctive strength of someone who intended to hold on to whatever good things came her way. "Hope," Maggie said without hesitation, her voice hoarse from the hours of labor but filled with a certainty that surprised even her. "Her name is Hope Flynn Red Cloud, because she represents everything we're fighting for, the possibility that people from different worlds can come together and create something beautiful instead of something broken. She's proof that love can grow in the strangest places, and that the future doesn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past." The hyphenated name was a declaration as much as an identity, a statement that this child would belong to multiple cultures and be bound by none of their limitations. She would be Irish and Lakota, Mormon and Catholic, American, and something else entirely that didn't yet have a name. Robert nodded slowly, understanding the significance of what Maggie was offering, not just a name, but a family, a future, a chance for all of them to be something more than the sum of their separate tragedies. Over the following weeks, as Maggie recovered her strength and baby Hope grew more alert and demanding, the three adults began to understand what their new life in Zion's Rest might look like. The Mormon community had embraced them with a generosity that seemed almost too good to be true, but it came with expectations that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and their place in the world. The Mormons believed in hard work, communal responsibility, and the kind of practical faith that showed itself in gardens planted in barns, raised rather than in lengthy theological debates. Every member of the community was expected to contribute according to their abilities, and those abilities were assessed with the practical eye of people who couldn't afford to waste any resource, human or otherwise. Robert, despite his blindness, proved invaluable as a teacher and advisor. His knowledge of cavalry tactics and wilderness survival made him a natural instructor for the settlements, young men who might someday need to defend their community against Apache raids or federal interference. His experience with different cultures and languages also made him an effective mediator when disputes arose between families from different backgrounds. Timothy threw himself into the communal life of Zion's Rest with the enthusiasm of a child who had finally found a place where his mixed heritage was seen as a blessing rather than a burden. The Mormon children accepted him immediately, drawn to his stories of life on the trail and his hard-won skills in tracking, hunting, and survival. He began attending the settlement school, where he quickly proved himself an exceptional student, with an appetite for learning that impressed his teachers. But it was Maggie who faced the greatest challenges in adapting to their new life. The Mormon women welcomed her warmly, but they also had very definite ideas about proper behavior for wives and mothers. Her independence, her willingness to speak, her mind on political matters, and her obvious competence with weapons marked her as different in ways that weren't necessarily comfortable for everyone in a community where traditional gender roles were both practical necessity and religious doctrine. "They mean well," she confided to Robert one evening as they sat on the porch watching Timothy play with the other children in the settlement's central square, while Hope slept peacefully in her arms. "But sometimes I feel like they're trying to wrap me in cotton wool, as if having a baby has somehow made me fragile. They don't seem to understand that I've been taking care of myself and others for a long time now, and I'm not about to stop just because I found a safe place to rest." Robert nodded thoughtfully, his sightless eyes fixed on the sounds of children at play that filled the evening air. "They're trying to give you the kind of protection their own women expect and value. In their world, a woman's strength shows itself in different ways than it does in yours. The question is whether you can find a way to be yourself within their expectations, or whether you'll need to choose between being accepted and being authentic." The answer to that question came sooner than either of them expected. 3 months after Hope's birth, when the baby had grown into a healthy, demanding infant who seemed determined to explore every inch of her small world, riders appeared on the horizon, blue uniformed figures that brought back all the old fears and uncertainties they had hoped to leave behind forever. But this time, instead of running or hiding, the people of Zion's Rest stood together at their gates. Men, women, and children formed a solid wall of determination that spoke louder than any weapon about their commitment to protecting those who had sought sanctuary among them. When the cavalry officer demanded to search the settlement for fugitives, Caldwell's response was calm but absolute. "This is sovereign territory, Captain, settled and maintained by law-abiding citizens who ask nothing from the federal government except to be left alone to worship and live according to our own lights. You have no authority here without a properly executed warrant, and even then, you'd best be prepared to explain to Washington why you felt it necessary to threaten a peaceful religious community that has never caused trouble for anyone." The standoff lasted 3 tense hours, with armed Mormons facing down mounted cavalry while the entire settlement held its breath and prayed for a peaceful resolution. Children were kept inside, but their faces could be seen at windows watching, with wide eyes as their fathers and older brothers stood firm against federal authority. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone understood that one wrong word or sudden movement could turn the confrontation deadly. In the end, it was politics rather than courage that saved the day. The federal government had enough problems with Mormon resistance throughout the territory, without creating new incidents that might inflame tensions and bring unwanted attention from Washington. The cavalry officer, a pragmatic man who understood that his career depended on avoiding unnecessary conflicts, chose discretion over confrontation. As the soldiers rode away empty-handed, their dust trail disappearing into the desert heat, Maggie understood something important about the nature of the sanctuary they had found. It wasn't just a place where they could hide from their past. It was a community where people were willing to stand up for principles that mattered more than individual safety, where strangers could become family and where the future could be built on foundations stronger than fear. That night, as she fed baby Hope by lamplight while Robert and Timothy slept peacefully in the next room, Maggie Flynn Red Cloud looked out at the quiet streets of Zion's Rest and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the deep satisfaction of being truly home. Not just in a place, but among people who understood that family was something you chose rather than something you inherited. 2 years had passed since the cavalry's last visit to Zion's Rest, and the settlement had grown from a modest collection of adobe buildings into a thriving community that stretched across 3 valleys. Hope Flynn Red Cloud had taken her first steps on the wooden floors of the schoolhouse Robert had helped design, and her laughter could be heard echoing through the workshops where Timothy, now 10 years old, was learning the blacksmith's trade from Brother Hanson, a gentle giant of a man whose massive hands could shape iron with surprising delicacy. The transformation of their lives had been remarkable in ways that none of them could have imagined. During those desperate days fleeing across the desert, Robert had become the settlement's unofficial military advisor, teaching young men not just how to shoot and fight, but how to think strategically about defense and survival. His blindness, rather than being a limitation, had given him insights into leadership that sighted men often missed. He listened more carefully, judged people by their words and actions rather than their appearance, and understood the value of preparation over bravado. Timothy had blossomed into a confident young man who moved easily between the different worlds that intersected in Zion's Rest. He spoke Lakota with his father, English with the Mormon children, and was learning Spanish from the Mexican families who had joined the settlement seeking refuge from bandit raids along the border. His mixed heritage, which had once made him a target for persecution, now made him a valuable bridge between communities that might otherwise have remained suspicious of each other. Maggie had found her own place in the community structure, though not without some initial friction. The Mormon women had at first tried to fit her into their traditional patterns of behavior, But her experience as a widow who had survived alone in hostile territory made her unsuited for the purely domestic role they initially envisioned for her. Instead, she had carved out a unique position as the settlement's unofficial diplomat and negotiator, someone who could deal with the outside world when necessary. But prosperity brought its own challenges, and the telegram that arrived on a dusty Tuesday morning in September carried news that would test everything the community had built together. The telegraph operator, a nervous young man named Brother Williams who had learned his trade working for the railroad before joining the Mormon migration, delivered the message to Caldwell with hands that visibly trembled as he read the federal seal on the envelope. "Congress has passed the Edmunds Act," Caldwell announced grimly to the assembled community leaders gathered in the meeting hall that served as both church and town center. "They're demanding that we renounce plural marriage, register all births and deaths with federal authorities, and submit to territorial oversight of our courts and schools. Any man with more than one wife faces imprisonment, and any community that harbors polygamists will lose its territorial status and be subject to direct federal administration." The news fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of concern and anger throughout the room. For the Mormons of Zion's Rest, the right to live according to their religious beliefs wasn't just a matter of principle, it was the foundation upon which they had built their entire society, the reason they had fled to this isolated corner of the wilderness in the first place. Many of the men in the room had risked everything to establish families according to their faith, and the women had made equally difficult sacrifices to build a community where their children could grow up surrounded by shared values. Brother Jensen, a man in his 40s with 3 wives and 12 children, spoke first, his voice tight with emotion. "They want us to choose between our families and our freedom," he said. "How can a government that claims to value liberty demand that we destroy the very relationships that give our lives meaning? They're asking us to betray everything we believe in, everything we've worked to build here." Sister Hanson, whose husband was the blacksmith training Timothy, raised her hand to speak. "What about the children?" she asked, her voice carrying the practical concern of a mother who had raised 6 sons and daughters in the desert. "If our marriages aren't recognized by federal law, what happens to our children's inheritance rights? What happens to families where the mothers aren't the legal wives? Are they to be declared illegitimate and stripped of their birthright?" Robert, who had become one of Caldwell's most trusted advisors despite his recent arrival in the community, raised a scarred hand to speak. His position in the settlement was unique as someone who wasn't technically Mormon, but had been fully accepted into the community. His perspective often provided valuable insights that those too close to the situation might miss. "How many families would be affected if these laws are enforced?" he asked quietly. His blindness had made him acutely sensitive to the emotional undercurrents in any gathering, and he could sense the fear and determination warring in the voices around him. "Nearly half our adult men have taken plural wives," Caldwell replied, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility for so many lives. "And most of our children were born outside what the federal government considers legal marriage. If we comply with these demands, we'll be destroying families and condemning our own neighbors to poverty and exile. If we resist, they'll send the army to enforce their will. And we've all heard what happened to communities that tried to fight federal authority directly." The reference was to Mountain Meadows and other incidents where Mormon resistance to federal authority had ended in bloodshed and tragedy. Everyone in the room understood that they were facing a choice with no good options: submit to laws that would destroy their way of life, or resist and risk the kind of violent suppression that had scattered other Mormon communities to the winds. In the weeks that followed, Zion's Rest became a community divided not by factional disputes, but by the weight of an impossible choice. Some families began making quiet preparations to leave for Mexico or Canada, where Mormon communities might find more tolerance for their way of life. The Johansson family, with their 5 wives and 23 children, began packing there. belongings for a journey to a settlement in Alberta, where Brigham Young had sent advance parties years earlier. Others spoke of armed resistance, of making the government pay a high price for any attempt to destroy what they had built with their own hands. Brother Peterson, a veteran of the Mormon Battalion who had served in the Mexican War, argued passionately for organizing the community's defenses and preparing for a siege that might last months. "We didn't come this far to surrender to politicians who've never built anything more challenging than a campaign speech," he declared. Still others advocated for legal resistance, hiring lawyers and fighting the new laws in territorial courts that might be more sympathetic to Mormon concerns. Brother Taylor, who had studied law before his conversion, spent his days drafting petitions and appeals that might delay federal enforcement long enough for political winds to change in Washington. Maggie found herself caught in the middle of debates that had no good answers. As an Irish Catholic who had married into the Mormon community through circumstance rather than conversion, she understood both the passion for religious freedom and the practical realities of confronting federal power. Her own experience with persecution had taught her that sometimes survival required compromise, but it had also shown her that some principles were worth dying for. "What do you think we should do?" Sarah Caldwell asked during one of their regular quilting circles, where the women of the community gathered to work and share the burdens of their hearts. The question carried extra weight because everyone knew that Maggie's counsel had proven valuable in past crises. "You've seen more of the world than most of us. You know what the government is capable of when it decides to crush something it doesn't understand." Maggie's needle paused in its careful stitching as she considered her answer. Around the circle, other women waited for her response. These women who had welcomed her as a sister despite her different faith, who had helped deliver her daughter and supported her through the difficult early months of motherhood in a strange land. Sister Martinez sat to her left, her dark eyes reflecting years of persecution, both as a Mormon and as a Mexican, in territories where her people were often treated as barely human. Sister Thompson was on her right, young and pregnant with her third child, her face showing the strain of wondering what kind of world she was bringing children into. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood their potential impact, "that we have to ask ourselves what we're really fighting for. Are we fighting for the right to live as plural families, or are we fighting for the right to live free from government interference in our private lives? Because those might be different battles, and they might require different strategies. The question isn't just what we're willing to die for, it's what we're willing to live for." Her words sparked a heated discussion that continued long after the quilting circle ended. Some women argued that plural marriage was a commandment from God that couldn't be abandoned for political convenience, that compromising on this principle would be the first step toward abandoning everything that made their community unique. Others suggested that the principle of religious freedom was more important than any specific practice, and that strategic retreat might preserve the community's independence better than martyrdom. Sister Hanson spoke up with the authority of a woman who had raised children through drought, Apache raids, and the constant uncertainty of frontier life. "I've been thinking about what Maggie said, about what we're willing to live for," she said. "My children, all of them, from 3 different mothers, they don't care about politics or federal laws. They care about having enough to eat, about learning to read, about knowing they're loved and protected. If we can preserve that, maybe the rest is just details." But Sister Jensen, whose husband faced the most immediate threat from the new laws, disagreed sharply. "Those details are our children's identity," she said, her voice rising with emotion. "If we abandon plural marriage, we're telling them that their families aren't real, that the love between their parents isn't legitimate. How can we ask them to be proud of who they are if we're ashamed of how they came to be?" Timothy, who had been quietly absorbing these adult conversations with the intense focus he brought to everything, surprised everyone by asking a question that cut to the heart of the matter. The boy had been spending more time with the adults lately, as his intelligence and maturity had earned him a place in discussions that would normally be restricted to grown-ups. "If the soldiers come again," he said during a family dinner, "will they try to take Papa away because he's not really married to you, Maggie? Will they say Hope isn't legitimate because her parents aren't married in their church? Will they try to separate our family because we don't fit their rules?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that none of them had fully considered. Their own unconventional family, a blind Sioux veteran and Irish widow, and the children they had claimed as their own existed outside the boundaries of both Mormon and federal law. They had found acceptance in Zion's Rest precisely because it was a community that valued chosen families over blood relations. But that acceptance might not survive a direct confrontation with authorities, determined to impose their own definitions of proper behavior. Robert had been thinking about this problem for weeks, ever since the first news of the Edmunds Act had reached them. "The federal government isn't really interested in our personal relationships," he said finally. "They're interested in power in proving that they can impose their will on any community that dares to be different. The specific issue is less important than the principle of control. They've chosen plural marriage as the wedge to split Mormon communities apart because they think it's something that will horrify the general public." It was Robert who provided the answer that would guide their decision, drawing on his experience as both a military man and someone who had survived persecution by thinking strategically rather than emotionally. "I've spent my whole life watching governments try to solve problems by destroying the people who pointed out those problems existed," he said quietly. "The cavalry tried to solve the Indian problem by chaining men and children to rocks. The federal marshals want to solve the Mormon problem by breaking up families and scattering communities. Maybe it's time someone showed them a different way." His proposal was radical in its simplicity. Instead of hiding from the federal authorities or fighting them directly, Zion's Rest would invite them in and demonstrate through example rather than argument that their community posed no threat to federal interests. They would open their schools to inspection, their courts to observation, their families to scrutiny, and let the marshals see for themselves what they would be destroying if they enforced the new laws to the letter. "You're talking about taking an enormous risk," Caldwell said when Robert presented the plan to the community council in a private session that lasted well into the night. "These men aren't coming here to learn or understand. They're coming to enforce laws that were written specifically to destroy us. They might see our openness as weakness or worse, as an admission of guilt. We could be handing them everything. They need to arrest half our men and break up our families." But Robert had thought through the implications carefully, drawing on both his military experience and his understanding of human nature. "They're expecting resistance," he said. "They're prepared for armed confrontation, legal challenges, and communities that scatter into the wilderness rather than submit to federal authority. They're not prepared for a community that welcomes them as guests and treats their investigation as an opportunity for dialogue rather than conflict. Sometimes the best defense is to remove the enemy's justification for attack." Brother Peterson, the veteran who had advocated for armed resistance, shook his head skeptically. "You're assuming these federal marshals are reasonable men who can be persuaded by evidence and good intentions. My experience with government officials suggests they're more interested in following orders than in understanding the people those orders affect. They have quotas to fill and careers to advance. Why would they risk either for the sake of a community they've already been told is criminal?" The plan that emerged from weeks of careful discussion was unlike anything any of them had attempted before, a delicate balance between accommodation and resistance that would require perfect execution to avoid disaster. When the federal marshals arrived in early November, accompanied by a small detachment of cavalry and a territorial judge, they found the gates of Zion's Rest wide open and the entire community gathered in the central square to welcome them with a feast that had been days in the preparation, Marshal James Fitzgerald was a career lawman who had spent years chasing outlaws and enforcing federal authority in territories where government power was often more theoretical than real. He was a practical man in his 50s who had learned to judge situations by results rather than rhetoric, and he had expected sullen resistance or desperate flight from the Mormon community, not the warm hospitality and genuine curiosity with which he was greeted by people who seemed genuinely eager to show him their way of life. "We understand you have concerns about our community," Caldwell said simply, stepping forward to shake the marshal's hand with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. "We'd like to invite you to stay with us for as long as you need to conduct your investigation. We have nothing to hide, and we believe that understanding grows better in the light of honest conversation than in the shadows of suspicion and fear. Our homes are open to you. Our records are available for your inspection, and our people are ready to answer any questions you might have." What followed was unlike any law enforcement operation Fitzgerald had ever conducted. Instead of serving warrants and making arrests, he found himself attending school classes where children from multiple families learned together, their recitations in English, Spanish, and occasionally Lakota demonstrating an educational system that produced remarkably literate and articulate young people. He observed court sessions where disputes were resolved through mediation rather than punishment, where the emphasis was on restoring community harmony rather than imposing penalty for wrongdoing. Most importantly, he shared meals with families whose relationships defied easy categorization, but whose love for each other was unmistakable. In the Jensen household, he watched 3 women work together to raise 12 children with the efficiency and affection that put many conventional families to shame. The children were polite, well-educated, and clearly secure in their identities, showing none of the psychological damage that critics of polygamy claimed was inevitable in such arrangements. Timothy appointed himself as the marshal's unofficial guide, showing him around the settlement with the pride of someone who had helped build something worth defending. The boy's easy confidence and obvious education challenged Fitzgerald's preconceptions about what life in a polygamous community might look like for children. Here was a young man who spoke multiple languages, could read and write better than many adults, and displayed the kind of practical competence that came from growing up in a community where everyone contributed to the common good. "Are you happy here?" Fitzgerald asked during one of their walks, genuinely curious about the boy's perspective on his unusual circumstances. "Do you feel like you have the same opportunities as children in more conventional families? Do you ever wonder what life might be like in a regular town with regular families?" Timothy considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, his dark eyes thoughtful as he weighed his response. "I'm learning to read and write in 3 languages," he said finally. "I can track game across 20 miles of desert, shoe a horse, help deliver a baby, and shoot well enough to keep my family safe. I have 6 mothers who care about my education, 4 fathers who teach me different skills, and more brothers and sisters than I can count. I guess that seems like pretty good opportunities to me. As for regular families, I've seen what regular gets you in this territory, and I'll stick with what we have here." The marshal's final report to Washington contained recommendations that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of calling for the dissolution of Zion's Rest or the arrest of its polygamous citizens, Fitzgerald recommended a policy of tolerance and gradual integration that would allow the community to continue existing while slowly adapting to federal requirements. His report painted a picture of a law-abiding, prosperous community that contributed to territorial stability rather than threatening it. "These people pose no threat to federal authority or territorial stability," he wrote in his careful, measured prose. "Their community is peaceful, productive, and well-governed according to principles that, while different from mainstream American values, produce results that any civilized society would admire. Their children are educated, their elderly are cared for, and their disputes are resolved without violence or appeal to outside authority. I recommend that we work with them rather than against them, understanding that forced compliance often produces worse outcomes than voluntary cooperation. The victory was not complete. Some families still chose to leave for Canada or Mexico, rather than risk future changes in federal policy. And the threat of renewed persecution always lurked in the background of community planning, but it was real enough to celebrate. Zion's Rest had survived its greatest test not through armed resistance or clever legal maneuvering, but through the simple expedient of demonstrating that their way of life produced good citizens and stable families. As winter settled over the settlement, bringing the deep snows that would isolate them from the outside world for several months, Maggie reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day at Devil's Canyon. The chains that had bound Robert and Timothy to the rocks had been broken by simple human decency, but the chains of prejudice and misunderstanding had proven harder to shatter. Yet even those bonds were weakening, she thought, as she watched Hope play with the other children in the schoolyard, while Timothy helped Robert teach a group of young men the finer points of wilderness survival. They had built something here that transcended the categories governments used to divide people, not Mormon or Gentile, not white or Indian, not legitimate or illegitimate, but simply human beings choosing to care for each other despite their differences. The future remained uncertain, as futures always did on the frontier, where change was the only constant and survival depended on adaptability as much as strength. But for the first time since fleeing Boston with grief and an unborn child, Maggie felt confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family, a community, and a living example of what America could become when it chose hope over fear, understanding over prejudice, and love over the artificial divisions that kept people apart. 15 years had passed since federal marshals rode away from Zion's Rest, carrying a different story than they had come to write. Hope Flynn Red Cloud, now 17 with her mother's copper hair and her father's keen intelligence, stood at the podium of the Territorial Capitol building in Phoenix, addressing senators, governors, and newspaper reporters from across the American West. I stand before you today, not as the product of any single tradition, she said, her clear voice carrying to the packed auditorium, but as living proof that America's strength comes from embracing what makes us different. I am the daughter of an Irish widow and a Lakota warrior, raised in a Mormon community that valued character over blood. I am what happens when love refuses to be bound by the chains of prejudice. In the audience, Maggie Flynn Red Cloud sat with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, watching her daughter address some of the most powerful men in the territory. Beside her, Robert's sightless eyes were bright with pride, while Timothy, now 25 and serving as Hope's campaign manager, beamed with satisfaction at watching his sister become everything they had dreamed she could be. Hope's speech that day would be reprinted in newspapers across the nation, becoming a rallying cry for women's suffrage and inspiring young people caught between worlds. But the real legacy wasn't measured in headlines. It was written in the lives they had touched through the simple act of refusing to accept limitations others tried to place on them. The schoolhouse in Zion's Rest had become a model for integrated education, drawing visitors from Eastern universities, studying how children from different backgrounds could learn together without losing their identities. Timothy had become its principal at 23, implementing methods that incorporated Lakota storytelling, Irish folk wisdom, and Mormon practical skills into a curriculum, producing remarkably well-rounded graduates. Robert had written a memoir titled Seeing Without Sight, a warrior's journey from chains to freedom, that became required reading at West Point. His insights into leadership and the psychology of prejudice influenced a generation of officers who handled Indian affairs with unprecedented fairness and understanding. The settlement had become a stop on what people called the Second Underground Railroad, a network helping anyone fleeing persecution find a place where differences were seen as strengths rather than weaknesses. Maria Santos, fleeing an abusive marriage, had arrived pregnant and penniless. welcomed by the community, and helped to establish a successful weaving business that now employed dozens of women. Even Marshal James Fitzgerald had been transformed. His final assignment was establishing a new model for federal oversight based on cooperation rather than coercion. The Zion's Rest Protocol became the standard for how authorities interacted with religious and ethnic communities throughout the Western Territories. As Hope concluded her historic speech and the audience rose in thunderous applause, the three people who had begun this journey, chained at Devil's Canyon, reflected on how far they had traveled, not just in miles, but from despair to hope, from isolation to community, from victims to leaders. Do you think we did right by her? Maggie asked Robert as they watched Hope accept congratulations from territorial leaders, raising her to believe she could be anything in a world that tells women and minorities to know their place. Robert smiled, his weathered hand finding hers with 20 years of familiarity. Look at her, he said simply. Look at what she's become, how she carries herself among men who thought they could intimidate her into silence. We gave her the tools to do right by everyone who comes after her. Timothy fell into step beside them as they walked through Phoenix's lamplit streets. The Chicago Reporter wants to write about our family, he said. About how we came together, what we've built, what it means for the country's future. I told him he'd have to ask what you were willing to share. Let him write his story. Maggie said, looking back at the Capitol where her daughter was still surrounded by admirers. But tell him to get it right. This isn't about one family finding happiness. It's about what becomes possible when people refuse to let fear write the ending to their story. We were chained to die at a canyon's edge, and we turned that into the beginning of something beautiful. Years later, historians would point to Hope's speech as the moment America began understanding that strength lay not in enforcing conformity, but in celebrating those who dared to be different. But the people of Zion's Rest knew better. The real turning point came when a pregnant Irish widow heard cries echoing from Devil's Canyon and chose to climb into hell rather than ride away from someone else's suffering. Everything that followed the community they built, the lives they saved, the barriers they broke grew from that single moment when love proved stronger than the chains that bind us.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.